In August 1973, a bank robbery in Stockholm went wrong. 4 hostages spent 6 days locked in a vault with their captors, no sunlight, barely any food, guns pointed at them around the clock. When police finally got them out, something happened that nobody expected. The hostages defended the robbers. One hostage, Kristen Enmark, called the Swedish Prime Minister directly from inside the bank and told him she fully trusted the men holding her captive. She wasn't desperate, she said. What she was scared of was the police. Another hostage, the day after her release, asked a psychiatrist, "Is there something wrong with me? Why don't I hate them?" Psychologists were baffled. The press eventually coined it Stockholm Syndrome, though it's worth noting that term has been contested ever since, and it's never been formally recognized as a disorder by the American Psychiatric Association. But here's the thing nobody talks about. What was actually happening inside those people's minds wasn't some quirk, wasn't weakness. It was the brain doing exactly what it was designed to do when there is no way out. And once you understand what that mechanism is, you'll start seeing it everywhere, in cults, in toxic relationships, in war prisoners, in certain jobs, and maybe, if you're honest with yourself, somewhere in your own life. Stay with me, because this goes much deeper than a hostage. Before we get into Stockholm vaults and solitary confinement cells, let's talk about what trapped actually means to the human brain. You'd think it's simple, no exits, locked door, game over. But the nervous system doesn't need physical walls to feel trapped. All it needs is the perception that choice has disappeared. In 1967, psychologist Martin Seligman and his colleague Stephen Meyer ran a now famous experiment at the University of Pennsylvania. They placed 3 groups of dogs in harnesses. The first group was simply restrained for a period and then released. The second group received electric shocks, but they could end the shock at any time by pressing a panel with their noses. They learned to do this. The third group received the exact same shocks as the second group at the same intensity and duration, but their panel did nothing. The shock just came, and nothing they did changed anything. Then Seligman and Meyer moved all 3 groups to a new chamber, a shuttle box with a low barrier the dogs could easily jump over to escape the shocks. The first 2 groups figured it out almost immediately. The third group, most of them lay down on the floor and whimpered. They didn't even try. They had learned, from the harness, that their actions had no effect. And that learning didn't stay in the harness. It followed them into a completely different situation. This became the foundation for what Seligman called learned helplessness. And it's arguably one of the most important discoveries in 20th century psychology. When a mind learns that effort and outcome have no relationship, it doesn't just give up on that specific situation. The research showed it starts giving up on everything. Here's what makes this neurologically striking. Chronic, inescapable stress suppresses activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning, problem-solving, and seeing possibilities. More recent neuroscience, building on the original learned helplessness work, has found that it's actually passivity in the face of uncontrollable stress that may be the brain's default, not something learned so much as something that has to be overridden by the experience of having control. In other words, the experience of agency, of your actions mattering, is what keeps the thinking mind online. Strip that away, and the trap doesn't just hold you in place. It edits what you can see. But here's where it gets stranger. While the prefrontal cortex goes quiet, something else activates. The amygdala, your brain's threat detection center, starts running the show. And unlike the thinking brain, the amygdala has exactly one goal: survival right now. It doesn't care about your long-term plans. It doesn't care about dignity or logic or what made sense before you got trapped. It cares about one question: what in this environment can keep you alive? And that question produces a stunning pattern of behavior. In inescapable environments, people tend to orient toward whatever is most powerful nearby, even if that thing is the source of harm. This isn't stupidity or weakness. Based on what we know about survival neurobiology, this appears to be the threat detection system running one of its oldest programs. Align with strength, reduce the perception of threat, survive the next hour. The reasoning, if you can call it that, goes something like, if they wanted to kill me, they would have already, so they must not be all bad. And once that crack opens, bonding can follow. This is the most credible explanation for why the Stockholm hostages didn't just tolerate their captors, they defended them. It's consistent with documented cases of prisoners in abusive environments, sometimes expressing loyalty to those holding power over them. It's why people in controlling relationships often report genuinely feeling love for the person hurting them, not because love and harm are compatible, but because the brain, under prolonged threat with no exit, may begin to conflate the two. Neuroscientist and trauma researcher Bessel van der Kolk documented extensively how the trauma of inescapable threat doesn't stay in the mind, it migrates into the body. Chronic stress hormones, particularly cortisol and adrenaline, flood the system so persistently that the body essentially forgets what calm feels like. The nervous system calibrates itself to the trap as the new normal. His landmark work The Body Keeps the Score drew on decades of clinical research and helped shift how the field understands trauma. And that recalibration, that's when things get truly dark. If you want to see what no escape does to a mind at its most extreme, you look at solitary confinement. A 2023 report by the watchdog organization Solitary Watch, drawing on federal and state records, found that on any given day, more than 122,000 people in U.S. prisons and jails are held in solitary confinement, isolated for 22 or more hours a day, some for weeks, some for years, some for decades. In a typical solitary cell, roughly 6 by 9 feet, no meaningful human contact, fluorescent light, sometimes continuous, no reliable sense of time passing. Here's what the research shows happens, and the timeline is faster than you'd expect. Sensory deprivation experiments, like a landmark 1954 study at McGill University by Bexton, Heron, and Scott, where paid volunteers were isolated in small chambers with severely restricted sensory input, found that hallucinations and cognitive breakdown began within days, in some cases within hours, not because the volunteers were fragile, because the brain, deprived of external input, begins generating its own. It is a social organ. It needs stimulation and contact the way the body needs food. Stuart Gracian, a board-certified psychiatrist and former Harvard Medical School faculty member who spent decades evaluating prisoners in solitary, identified a consistent syndrome across his clinical work: hypersensitivity to external stimuli, perceptual distortions, panic attacks, difficulties with thinking and memory, and paranoia. In more severely affected cases, he documented states of dissociation and what he described as a breakdown of the psychological structures that normally hold a person together. What that means in plain language: people stopped feeling like themselves. Not because of memory loss, but because the self, it turns out, is partly constructed through relationship, through being seen, through contact with others. Cut that off for long enough, and the architecture of identity begins to lose coherence. The research strongly implies this isn't metaphorical. It appears to be a real neurological consequence of social deprivation. One former prisoner in Gracian's documentation described overhearing guards talking, and then not being sure whether they had spoken at all. That's not a person losing their mind. That's a person whose brain is trying to fill a void that shouldn't exist. Now here's the pattern interruption I want you to sit with. Everything we've talked about, the learned helplessness, the survival-driven bonding, the dissolution of self, these aren't only prison phenomena. They appear to operate at varying intensities in environments that don't look like traps at all. Chronic toxic workplaces. Relationships where one partner controls finances, social access, or what the other person is allowed to say aloud. Families where questioning the group narrative means losing everything. Communities where the cost of dissent is exile. The architecture of the trap looks different, but if the psychological mechanism is what Seligman's research suggests, if helplessness is really about the perceived absence of meaningful choice, then the brain arguably can't tell the difference between iron bars and invisible ones. Research on low-control environments in everyday life has found elevated stress markers, higher cortisol levels, suppressed executive function in people who feel chronically unable to influence their own circumstances, whether or not they are physically confined. This suggests the learned helplessness mechanism isn't limited to dramatic captivity scenarios. It may be active in far more ordinary lives than we'd like to think. What makes modern invisible traps particularly hard to escape is that they often come packaged with an illusion of choice. The door is technically open, but between financial dependency, social isolation, identity erosion, and a nervous system that has slowly recalibrated itself to the trap as home, leaving becomes cognitively much harder than it looks from the outside. Not weakness, not laziness, More accurately, a nervous system that has been shaped by its environment to see fewer options than actually exist. The Kristen Enmark story is useful here. She later said her feelings during the crisis were not irrational. The police had behaved recklessly, endangering her life multiple times. From inside the vault, her trust of the robbers over the police was, in a specific and narrow sense, reasonable. That's the trap's most insidious quality. It makes its own logic feel like the only logic. But here's something the research also shows, and this part matters. The brain is plastic, not permanently, irreversibly reshaped. Plastic, capable of change. When Seligman and Meyer's helpless dogs were physically guided over the barrier, their bodies moved through the motion of escape. They began to try on their own. The passive acceptance broke. Not through insight, not through motivation speech, through experience of a different outcome, repeated enough times to register. This maps directly onto what we understand about trauma recovery. Peter Levine, who has spent over 50 years developing what he calls somatic experiencing, has argued that trauma held in the body, the freeze, the collapse, the learned smallness, can be gradually released through carefully guided movement and incremental experiences of agency. The body, in his framework, isn't just a vessel for the traumatized mind. It's where the pattern is actually stored and where it can be unwound. The key word from both the animal research and the clinical trauma literature is incremental. Not a dramatic leap, a small one. A tiny exercise of choice, what to eat, which route to walk, how to arrange a single room, that sends a new signal to the system. Options exist. Something you do can change something around you. This is consistent with what historians and psychologists have documented about captivity survivors more broadly. Accounts of prisoners of war who maintained internal routines, who mentally constructed detailed plans, who found ways to mark time, who exercised quiet forms of agency within severe constraint, suggest that the capacity to locate some sliver of control, even symbolic, may function as psychological protection against the full weight of helplessness. We can infer from the learned helplessness research that this is plausible. If passivity is the default under uncontrollable conditions, then any experience of control, however small, may work against that default. Agency, even symbolic, may be biological armor. We started with Stockholm, a vault, 6 days. 4 people who came out changed in ways that shocked the world. But here's the real question the research leaves you with. How would you know if you were in a trap? By definition, the most complete traps are the ones that have convinced you they aren't traps at all. The ones that have recalibrated your nervous system so thoroughly that the walls feel like home. That have suppressed your executive functioning so effectively that alternatives feel literally unimaginable, not because they don't exist, but because the brain, under those conditions, has genuinely lost access to them. There's a thought experiment sometimes used informally in discussions of psychological freedom, not a clinical tool, just a frame worth trying. Imagine having full permission to leave. From the relationship, the job, the belief system, the city, whatever it is. Imagine the door is open, cost is 0, consequences are none. What do you feel? If the answer is relief mixed with terror, that's not unusual. That's transition anxiety. Normal. But if the answer is flatness, a kind of blankness, an inability to picture anything on the other side, that flatness is worth paying attention to. That might not be contentment. Based on what the research suggests about chronic helplessness, it could be a mind that has stopped generating alternatives, not because there aren't any, but because it has stopped believing there could be. The people who study captivity, in all its forms, seem to converge on one point. The first move out of a trap is almost never physical. It is perceptual. It is the moment the mind entertains, even tentatively, even briefly, the possibility that things could be different. Not certainty. Not a plan. Not courage in the Hollywood sense. Just the crack of a question. What if there is another way? Neurologically, that question is what begins to bring the prefrontal cortex back online. It's what restores the capacity to see options. That's where the escape starts, not at the door, but in the mind, before the body takes a single step. The mind under no escape does extraordinary, terrifying, and ultimately very logical things. It was never broken. It was always trying to survive the conditions it was given. The more interesting question, and the one worth carrying with you, is whether the conditions you're in right now are the ones you'd choose if you knew you could. If this made you think about something specific, Leave it in the comments. If you want to go deeper on any of this, the neuroscience, the clinical research, the recovery side, let me know below.